"Ma'am, final warning, hands where I can see them," the young tactical officer shouted, his voice strained with nervous energy. Martha Wilson, 73, her arms loaded with groceries from Kroger, struggled with her arthritic fingers, too slow to comply with the barked commands. Non-compliant subject, the officer yelled before discharging his taser. Frank Wilson, 76, her husband, a decorated but unassuming retired Delta Force Command Sergeant Major, watched in horror as his wife convulsed and collapsed while 3 AR-15s swung in his direction. Frank didn't scream, didn't run. He simply rose slowly to his feet, looked the tactical team leader dead in the eye, and spoke 5 quiet words. "Call Admiral Hayes right now." Every weapon froze. Frank Wilson was the kind of man who disappeared into the peaceful suburban backdrop of Maple Street. Neighbors knew him as the friendly retiree who could fix any Craftsman lawnmower, always offered a warm hello, and whose garage often echoed with the sounds of Creedence Clearwater Revival and the clink of tools. At 76, his hands, though still remarkably strong, carried the roadmap of a life lived hard. Calluses from tools, yes, but also faded scars from history best left unspoken. Few people knew that beneath the grandfatherly exterior was Command Sergeant Major Frank Wilson, U.S. Army Delta Force, retired, a man who had operated in shadows, guided teams through impossible situations, and whose service record contained commendations for valor in operations whose names remained classified. He preferred the anonymity. The peaceful life with Martha, his anchor for 51 years, was hard-earned. Martha understood the nightmares, respected the silences, and had helped him navigate the complex journey back to being simply Frank. Their modest Craftsman bungalow was their sanctuary, filled with the aroma of her homemade apple pie and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived together. Frank volunteered at the American Legion, mentored troubled teens in auto repair at Jefferson High, and maintained a deliberately low profile. His past remained a carefully protected secret known only to select few in Pentagon databases. That Thursday afternoon had started ordinarily enough. Frank was underneath his neighbor's old Ford F-150 doing an oil change as a favor. Martha had just returned from Safeway, her arms laden with grocery bags. The first indication of trouble was the screech of tires too fast, too aggressive for their peaceful neighborhood. Before Frank could slide from beneath the truck, black tactical vehicles and armored Bearcats swarmed Maple Street, disgorging a dozen heavily armed tactical officers in full combat gear, helmets hiding their faces, rifles at the ready. "Police, search warrant, everyone on the ground now," a voice boomed through a megaphone. Frank emerged slowly, hands raised, 10W30 oil still on his fingers, trying to process the overwhelming show of force surrounding him. "There must be some mistake," he called out. A rifle barrel gestured him silent. "Down on your face," an officer shouted. Frank complied, the rough concrete pressing against his cheek, the smell of exhaust fumes filling his nostrils. He heard shouts, radio chatter, the heavy thud of tactical boots encircling him. His wrists were roughly zip-tied behind his back. Through the chaos, he heard an officer shout, "Target vehicle matches description. House secure." That's when Martha's car, a familiar silver Buick, pulled into their driveway. She stepped out, Safeway bags in both arms, her face etched with confusion and fear, as she saw her husband face down on the ground, surrounded by armed men. "Frank, what's happening?" 3 officers immediately pivoted toward her, weapons raised. "Police, drop the bags, hands where we can see them." Martha froze, the paper bags clutched to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, I don't understand." "She's not complying," a young officer, his voice cracking with adrenaline and youthful aggression, shouted. "Ma'am, final warning. Drop the bags." Martha, her arthritic hands trembling, began lowering the bags, but she wasn't moving fast enough for the amped-up officer. "Non-compliant subject," he yelled. Then, without further warning, raised his taser and fired. Frank heard the sickening crackle, saw Martha's body convulse as the electricity ripped through her. The grocery bags exploded across the driveway, eggs shattering, milk splashing, Granny Smith apples rolling under tactical boots. Martha collapsed like a marionette with severed strings, a small whimpering sound escaping her lips. A wave of cold fury washed over Frank, so intense it nearly buckled him. But decades of special operations training, of maintaining absolute control in life or death situations, took over. He didn't scream, didn't struggle against his restraints. Instead, his mind became preternaturally calm, assessing, analyzing. He saw the young officer who had fired the taser, his face now a mixture of bravado and dawning horror. He saw the tactical commander, older, more experienced, observing the scene with a deepening frown. That was his target. "Let me up," Frank said, his voice quiet but with an edge of command that cut through the surrounding noise, making several officers flinch. The commander hesitated for a split second, then gave a curt nod to a nearby officer, who reluctantly cut Frank's zip ties. Frank rose slowly, deliberately to his feet. He didn't rush to Martha, though every fiber of his being screamed to do so. He knew the priorities. First, de-escalate the threat. First, regain control of the situation. He walked steadily toward the tactical commander, ignoring the rifles still warily aimed in his direction. He stopped directly in front of him, looked him dead in the eye, and uttered 5 quiet, carefully enunciated words that hung in the suddenly chilled air. "Call Admiral Hayes right now." The tactical commander, a seasoned veteran named Captain Reynolds, blinked. The name, spoken with such calm authority by this oil-stained, unassuming old man whose wife lay tasered on the driveway, was utterly unexpected. "Admiral Hayes," Reynolds repeated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "Who the hell is Admiral Hayes to you, old man?" One of the younger tactical officers snickered. "Yeah, save it, Grandpa. We're here for a major drug trafficker, Miguel the Butcher Sanchez. Got a warrant, says he's holed up in this house." Frank didn't even glance at the younger officer. His gaze remained locked on Captain Reynolds. "This is 124 Maple Street," Frank stated calmly. "Your warrant is likely for 124 Maple Avenue, different zip code, other side of the county. A common dispatcher error for this area." He paused. "Admiral William Steele Bill Hayes, chairman of the Joint Special Operations Command. He and I go way back. You have 2 minutes to get him on your satellite phone before this situation escalates into a national security incident you can't even begin to comprehend. And while you're at it," Frank added, his voice dropping almost to a whisper yet carrying more menace than any shout, "you might want to get a medic for my wife. She has a heart condition. If anything happens to her because of your cowboy's itchy trigger finger, Admiral Hayes will be the least of your worries." Captain Reynolds stared at Frank, truly seeing him for the first time, the unwavering steel in his eyes, the absolute certainty in his voice, the almost preternatural calm in the face of overwhelming force. This wasn't the panicked rambling of an ordinary civilian. This was something else entirely. Doubt, cold and sharp, pierced Reynolds' professional composure. "Check that address now," he barked into his radio to another officer. "Get the medic over to the woman. Stat." He looked back at Frank. "And if this is some kind of bluff, old man." "I don't bluff, Captain," Frank interrupted quietly. "Not with my wife's life on the line." Left breast pocket of my jacket, carefully. Reynolds hesitated, then gestured for an officer to check. The officer cautiously reached into Frank's jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it, then his eyes widened. He wordlessly handed it to Captain Reynolds. Inside, nestled beside a faded photo of a younger Frank and Martha, was a battered nondescript military ID card. But it wasn't the ID itself that made Reynolds' blood run cold. It was the small, almost invisible phoenix symbol embossed in the corner, a symbol recognized only by those in the highest echelons of classified operations, denoting access and authority that superseded almost everything. "Phoenix clearance," Reynolds breathed, the color draining from his face. He'd only ever seen it once before, in a top-secret briefing years ago. It meant this man was practically a ghost, someone whose real name probably wasn't even on this ID, someone who answered only to the very highest levels. "Get me JSOC command. Priority Alpha now." Reynolds roared into his radio, his earlier skepticism replaced by raw panic. "Patch me through to Admiral Hayes' personal satellite line. Tell them it's a code Phoenix authentication. Field initiated." The entire tactical team seemed to freeze. The term Phoenix rippled through their comms, silencing all other chatter. Rifles were subtly, almost imperceptibly lowered. The young officer who had tasered Martha looked like he was about to throw up. He knew with sickening certainty that his career had just imploded. Frank, meanwhile, finally moved toward Martha, kneeling beside her as the team medic rushed over. He gently took her hand, his touch infinitely tender. "It's all right, sweetheart," he murmured. "It's going to be all right." His eyes, however, when he briefly glanced back at Captain Reynolds, were like chips of Arctic ice. The next 10 minutes were a blur of frantic activity and dawning horror for Captain Reynolds and his tactical team. Dispatch confirmed the warrant address was indeed Maple Avenue. The target, Sanchez, had been apprehended there by another team 20 minutes earlier without incident. They had hit the wrong house. They had tasered the wife of a man who, according to the panicked encrypted whispers now coming through Reynolds' earpiece from JSOC, was a national asset of the highest possible value. A legendary figure whose exploits were the stuff of hushed awe in clandestine circles. Then Admiral Hayes himself came on the line, his voice like gravel and thunder. Reynolds had never been dressed down so thoroughly, so coldly, so terrifyingly in his entire career. Reynolds stood stiffly, taking the verbal barrage. "Yes, Admiral." "No, Admiral." "I understand, Admiral." "My profound apologies, Admiral." When the call ended, Reynolds looked like a broken man. He approached Frank, who was still kneeling beside Martha, now conscious but disoriented and in pain, being attended by the medic. "Mr. Wilson, Sergeant Wilson." "Sir," Reynolds stammered, his face ashen. "There are no words. We made a catastrophic error. The address, your wife. On behalf of myself and my entire team, I offer our deepest, most sincere apologies." Frank slowly looked up, his eyes unyielding. "Apologies won't fix a potential heart arrhythmia, Captain. Apologies won't erase the terror your team inflicted on an innocent civilian in her own driveway." This, he gestured around at the heavily armed officers, the armored vehicles, "is not policing. This is an occupation force, and you, Captain, are a piss-poor commander for allowing it to happen." Before Reynolds could respond, the distinct thrum of heavy rotors filled the air. Two sleek, black, unmarked helicopters, the kind that didn't appear on civilian radar, descended rapidly, landing with practiced precision in the wide street, their downdraft whipping leaves and debris into a frenzy. Men in dark civilian suits, carrying specialized equipment, disembarked, moving with quiet, lethal efficiency. One of them, clearly in charge, approached Admiral Hayes, who had impossibly also just arrived via one of the helicopters, looking every inch the 4-star warrior, even in his slightly rumpled travel uniform. "Sergeant Wilson," Admiral Hayes said, his voice rough with concern as he strode directly to Frank, completely ignoring Captain Reynolds and the tactical team. He clasped Frank's shoulder firmly. "Are you and Martha all right, old friend?" "Martha's been tasered, Bill," Frank said, his voice flat, "by that trigger-happy recruit over there." He nodded toward the young officer, who flinched as if struck. Hayes' eyes, already hard, turned to granite. He didn't even speak to the young officer. He just looked at him, and in that look, the young man saw his future, or lack thereof. The arrival of Admiral Hayes and the unmarked federal team effectively ended the tactical team's involvement. The suited agents, clearly from a very specialized, very discreet agency, took over. They facilitated Martha's immediate transport via one of the black helicopters to the nearest top-tier cardiac hospital for a full evaluation. With Frank by her side, Admiral Hayes stayed behind to liaise with Captain Reynolds and the local police chief, who had arrived looking like he'd seen a ghost. The liaison was reportedly brief, brutal, and resulted in Captain Reynolds being immediately suspended. The young officer who fired the taser facing a full internal affairs and likely criminal investigation, and the entire tactical unit being stood down pending a top-to-bottom review by federal observers. The wrong address, the excessive force, the tasering of an elderly woman, the involvement of a Phoenix operative, it was a perfect storm of procedural failure and catastrophic misjudgment. Frank Wilson's 5 words had not just frozen a tactical team. They had triggered a systemic earthquake that would ripple through local law enforcement and echo in very quiet, very high-level offices in Washington, D.C. for a long time to come. Martha, thankfully, was found to have no lasting cardiac damage from the taser, though she was badly bruised, shaken, and deeply traumatized. Frank stayed by her side, his quiet strength her anchor. They returned to their small bungalow a few days later, the driveway scrubbed clean of spilled groceries, but not of the memory. Admiral Hayes visited them personally, not as an admiral, but as Bill, an old friend, offering support, ensuring they had everything they needed, including discreet top-level security until any potential blowback from the Sanchez cartel, who might mistakenly think Frank was involved in the raid on their actual safe house, was neutralized. In the weeks that followed, changes rippled through the local police department. The tactical team was disbanded, then rebuilt from the ground up with new leadership, new protocols, and significantly more oversight. The young officer who had tasered Martha was dismissed from the force and faced criminal charges for excessive use of force against an elderly civilian. Captain Reynolds, stripped of his command, resigned rather than face demotion. The police chief, under intense federal scrutiny, implemented sweeping reforms in how warrants were verified and tactical operations conducted. None of this mattered much to Frank and Martha. They focused on healing, Martha from the physical trauma, both of them from the psychological impact of having their sanctuary violated, their safety threatened. Frank found himself slipping back into old habits, checking sightlines, identifying escape routes, keeping his back to walls, instincts he thought he'd left behind decades ago. Martha noticed but said nothing. She simply held his hand a little tighter, made his favorite meatloaf more often, and together they weathered this storm as they had so many others in their half-century together. Frank Wilson never sought the spotlight. He had simply reacted to protect his wife, and then to protect them both from a situation spiraling out of control. He had spoken 5 words, a key to a door few knew existed. He went back to fixing Chevrolets and mentoring kids, the quiet hero of Maple Street. But the local police department and its tactical team would never forget the day they raided the wrong house and encountered a legend whose quiet voice carried more weight than all their weapons combined. 3 months after the incident, Frank received a visitor, not Admiral Hayes this time, but a young woman in a crisp business suit who introduced herself as Special Agent Keller from the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. "We're conducting a nationwide review of tactical team procedures following incidents like yours," she explained, sitting in their living room, declining Martha's offer of sweet tea. "Your experience has become something of a catalyst, Mr. Wilson." Frank raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "The Phoenix Protocol," she continued. "That's what they're calling the new federal guidelines for warrant verification and force escalation, named after your clearance level." She smiled slightly. "Though officially, of course, it's just a bird rising from ashes." Frank nodded slowly, understanding the deeper message. His 5 words had indeed changed things. After Agent Keller left, Frank sat on the porch swing with Martha, watching the neighborhood kids play street hockey as the summer evening stretched long and golden. "They named a protocol after you," Martha said softly, her hand finding his. "My quiet hero." Frank smiled, the first real smile since that terrible day. "Not after me," he corrected gently. "After an idea. That true authority isn't about tactical gear and shouted commands. It's about a lifetime of proven courage, integrity, and knowing exactly who to call when things go catastrophically wrong." Martha leaned her head against his shoulder. 5 words, she murmured. Frank nodded, watching the neighborhood he loved, the life he'd fought for, the peace he'd earned. 5 words, because sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. 5 words, spoken with quiet certainty by someone who has earned the right to be heard. 5 words that stopped time.